Story 1. The frozen stalker of the Himalayas. I never should have come here. That thought looped in my head as I pressed my back against the frozen rock, my breath fogging in the thin, frigid air. The mountains stretched endlessly above and below me, a blinding wasteland of ice and stone. And somewhere out there, it was watching. We were supposed to be a team of 5, experienced mountaineers, but now it was just me. It started on the second night of our ascent up an unclimbed ridge near Makalu in the Himalayas. We had set up camp in a narrow crevice to shield ourselves from the wind, but the night was alive with strange noises. A low, guttural growl, something massive moving through the snow. Probably a snow leopard, our guide, Tenzing, whispered, but his eyes told a different story. He was afraid. The next morning, we found enormous footprints circling our tents. Not human, not bear, something bigger. Then, on the third day, we saw it. We had just crested a ridge when Mark, one of our climbers, froze. He pointed across the valley. There, on a distant slope, stood a towering figure covered in matted white fur. It was at least 8 feet tall, its arms unnaturally long, its head tilted slightly as if studying us. We stood in stunned silence. Then it moved. It covered ground fast, bounding over the ice with impossible ease. We scrambled back down toward camp, fear giving us speed. But that night, as we huddled together, we knew we weren't alone. One by one, my team disappeared. First, it was Daniel. He left the tent to relieve himself. We heard one muffled scream, then silence. When we rushed outside, all we found were drag marks in the snow leading off into the darkness. Then, the next night, it was Elena. The flaps of her tent had been ripped open, blood smeared across the ice. No body. By the 4th day, only Tenzing and I remained. He told me stories in hushed tones about the Mete, the mountain spirit that took those who dared climb too high. That night, we didn't sleep. We couldn't. The winds howled, but underneath them, we heard it breathing. A low, guttural inhale. It was close. Watching. Tenzing panicked and ran. I tried to stop him, but he vanished into the white void. And then, I was alone. I don't know how I made it through the night. Maybe it wanted to play with its prey, or maybe it was waiting for me to break. By sunrise, I was running, stumbling, down the mountain. My frostbitten fingers barely clung to the rope. My mind was shattered. I don't know how I survived. But when I reached the base camp, I was found half frozen, rambling about something that wasn't supposed to exist. They never found my team, but I know what happened. The mountain took them. It took them. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear its growl. Story 2. The howling thing in the Rockies. I never believed in monsters. Not until that winter. I was working as a backcountry ranger in the Rocky Mountains, assigned to a remote fire lookout station. The job was simple: monitor weather conditions, report any unusual activity, and keep an eye out for stranded hikers. Winter in the Rockies is unforgiving. Blizzards roll in fast, and the silence is overwhelming. But something else was out there with me. Something alive. It started with the howling. At first, I thought it was the wind. Long, moaning wails that echoed through the valleys. But one night, as I stepped out onto the tower's small balcony, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something calling. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow below my tower. Massive, inhuman, barefoot, but definitely not human. I radioed it in, half expecting my supervisor to laugh. Instead, there was a long pause before he finally spoke. "Stay inside after dark," he said. "Keep your rifle close." That night, I barely slept. The howling returned, closer this time. And then, something knocked on my cabin door. A slow, deliberate tap-tap-tap. I sat frozen, my rifle in my lap, staring at the wooden door. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. Then scratch. Long, deep gouges dragged across the wood. My breath hitched. The wind wasn't strong enough to cause that. Then came the breathing. A low, wet inhale, just beyond the door. I didn't sleep. I sat there, rifle aimed at the door, waiting for whatever was out there to go away. By dawn, the knocking had stopped. But when I finally gathered the courage to check outside, I found the door covered in claw marks, and in the snow, leading away into the forest, were the same massive footprints. I lasted one more night before I radioed for an emergency evacuation. My boss didn't argue. As the rescue team arrived by snowmobile, one of them, a veteran ranger, pulled me aside. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. He just sighed. "We don't talk about it. But yeah, it's out there." I never returned to that station. But sometimes, on quiet winter nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the howling. Story 3. Trapped in the Siberian wastes. I was a wildlife photographer. Before this. Before I saw it. In the winter of 2018, I took a job documenting rare wolves in Siberia's Ural Mountains. I had always loved the wilderness, the isolation, the challenge. But nothing prepared me for what waited in that frozen abyss. For the first week, it was just me, my guide, Pavel, and the unbroken white landscape. We traveled by snowmobile, setting up camera traps, scanning for wolf tracks. The air was bitterly cold, the silence absolute. Then, one night, we found something else's tracks. Not wolf, not bear, something bigger. The prints were huge, nearly twice the size of my boot. Barefoot. Pavel went pale. "We leave," he muttered. "Now." I protested. The tracks were fresh. Whatever made them was close. This was the chance of a lifetime. But Pavel wouldn't listen. He turned the snowmobile around, muttering prayers in Russian. That night, we camped in a small wooden outpost, miles from civilization. But I couldn't let it go. Around midnight, while Pavel slept, I grabbed my camera and followed the tracks into the trees. The forest was deathly silent. My breath came out in white puffs as I crept forward, my camera raised. Then, I saw it. A hulking figure stood just beyond the tree line, illuminated by the moonlight. It was massive, at least 10 feet tall, covered in long, tangled white fur. Its arms hung low, its breath misting in the cold air. But the eyes, they were red, burning, watching me. My body locked up. Every instinct screamed at me to run. Then, it moved. With unnatural speed, it lunged toward me, closing the distance in seconds. I barely managed to snap a photo before I turned and sprinted. Branches tore at my jacket. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees. I wasn't going to make it. Then, a gunshot. Pavel. He stood outside the cabin, rifle raised, eyes wide with terror. The creature stopped. It let out a horrible, guttural snarl, then vanished into the darkness. I collapsed into the snow, gasping. Pavel dragged me inside, bolting the door. "We leave at sunrise," he whispered. "No more talking." We fled the next morning. Pavel refused to speak about what happened. When we got back to town, he quit guiding for good. As for me, I checked my camera. The picture I took was gone. Corrupted. Erased. No one believes me. They say I imagined it, that I was too sleep-deprived, too cold. But I know what I saw. I still wake up sweating, dreaming of those red eyes. And sometimes, late at night, when I look out my window, I wonder if it ever followed me home.